In this video, we're going to talk about the significance of the trigrams within the hexagrams. When we study the book of I Ching, in every hexagram, we can see situations such as in this example of hexagram 53, we actually see a trigram that symbolizes water within the overall hexagram. So as we try to interpret the meaning of that particular hexagram, does that mean that we will experience crossing the water when we experience the hexagram through lines 2, 3, and 4? Does that mean line 2 corresponds to the experience of before you cross the river, and line 3 representing when you are crossing the river, and the line 4 representing that you have crossed the river? Is that the correct interpretation? So in this video, we're going to explore this relationship in detail. Before we proceed, I want to note that all the plots presented in this video contain a lot of useful information. So you may want to pause the video to digest the individual data, because we use plots to summarize large amounts of quantitative info. We all know that I Ching started out with 8 basic trigrams: the heaven, earth, thunder, lake, water, wind, mountain, and flames. And it's the combinations of these 8 trigrams that form 64 hexagrams. They are formed by having one trigram on the upper hexagram and one trigram on the lower hexagram. And the book of I Ching has a definition or interpretation of all 64 hexagrams. But there is no specific interpretation of the trigrams themselves specifically. So what is the auspiciousness characteristics of the trigram? One would think they're all neutral. It's neither good nor bad, aren't they? So to answer that question, we first look at, from our quantitative I Ching analysis, see if we can deduce anything from the so-called 8 stacked hexagrams. So in I Ching, there are 8 hexagrams where their upper hexagram and lower hexagrams are of the same trigrams. And there are 8 of these. They are hexagram 30, 2, 57, 1, 52, 29, 58, and hexagram 51, with average auspiciousness score being highest for the 30, hexagram 30, enlightening, and the least auspicious for hexagram 51, surviving consecutive dangers. But if we look underneath those stacked diagrams, individual lines, behaviors, then the stories are more complicated, because the auspiciousness of each of the 6 lines varies significantly for all 8 of the stacked hexagram. So the average score for the whole hexagram cannot tell us anything about the trigrams underneath. So we found out that we cannot deduce the auspiciousness characteristics of trigrams directly from the 8 stacked hexagram, because the auspiciousness of the upper hexagram differs from that of the lower hexagram. So next, we try to analyze the trigrams within hexagrams systematically, because there are only 4 possible trigrams positions in any hexagram. The trigram could be positioned at lines 1, 2, and 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, or 4, 5, 6. And so our systematic approach is to go through every possible position and try to see if we can deduce any general characteristics. So our analysis method is as follows. We first group together hexagrams that contain certain specific trigrams across certain line positions. For example, I will group all the hexagrams that has line 1, 2, and 3 that's representing the heaven trigrams. I group those hexagrams together. Once I group them, within each group, we average the auspiciousness score for each of the lines, the 6 lines, for all the hexagrams. Then finally, we plot the auspiciousness of the 3 lines that corresponding to the specific trigram that we're interested in. Okay, so here are the results. After we do that, when we are analyzing the trigrams appear in positions 1, 2, and 3, or 4, 5, and 6, because we first look at the lower hexagram configuration and upper hexagram configuration. The positive value are more auspicious and negative value represent more misfortune or anguish. So we can see that even for the same trigram, such as heaven, the behavior is different if the heaven appear in the upper trigrams versus the behaviors at the lower trigram. And that could be said for all 8 of these basic trigrams. So the trigrams auspiciousness analysis can be used to interpret other hexagrams in many cases. We can combine one trigram's lower hex behavior with another trigram's upper hex behavior. In a lot of cases, we can observe the overall auspiciousness behavior of a hexagram. So let me show you what we meant. For example, in hexagram 15, humility, we combine the plot for the upper trigrams of the earth with the plot of the mountain trigrams for the lower hex configuration. Then once we combine them, we combine these two plots together, they form a plot that very similar to the overall auspicious behavior of the hexagram 15 itself. You can see it go from the anguish to auspicious and then back down negative again. We have that shape right here on the first 3 lines, and then we have an auspicious indication at the line 4, just like right here, and then descending manner all the way to the end, and that resembles the behavior characteristics of the earth trigrams when they appear in the upper hex configuration. The next example is the hexagram 24, rebuilding from the ashes. Again, the upper hex is the earth trigrams, lower hex is the thunder trigrams. We combine these 2 plots together. The lower is a sloping down, descending slope, and the upper is start out with auspicious, but and then still descending significantly, and that's what somewhat similar to what we observe at the overall behavior when we quantize each lines. The next example is a hexagram 32, perpetuate righteous causes. Again, the upper hex trigram is the thunder, lower is the wind. We combine these 2 plots together. There are some deviations from the original plot, but you can see the general trend is there. And you can kind of tell which way they will go, especially like in thunder, he ends up in the anguish area, and indeed it's quite negative at the end of the hexagram. So we found this to be pretty useful because we can get additional clue to discern the meaning of original I Ching text. Once we know the behavior, which trigrams on the top and which trigrams on the bottom, then we can kind of estimate the behavior of the overall hexagram for certain lines within that hexagram. Are they more toward the auspicious area or the anguish area? Furthermore, we can get some more insights to the hexagrams themselves. For example, if we have a mountain trigram, the last line, when positioned at the upper hexagram, then it is generally auspicious. So that's what we mean by here. See the upper behavior of the mountain trigrams, it pitches up to the auspicious area. What does that mean? Does it mean that the subject is experiencing having conquered the mountain? Now the subject is at the mountaintop, so he feels very auspicious. Well, that's for you to consider. The next example is when the first line of thunder trigrams is located at the lower hex of the hexagram, and is generally auspicious, and that's what we mean by here. The lower hex configuration of the thunder trigrams, you start out with quite auspiciously. What does that mean? That when we encounter thunder at the lower hex, that means we start out with a bang, so it's always generally auspicious. Okay, we can give another inside example is the last line of the lake trigram is generally in anguish when positioned at the lower hexagram. So you can see that it start out with pretty auspiciously for the lower hex, whole lower hex configuration, but you end up in the anguish area. What does that mean? Maybe that means the good time is ending or too much indulgence. Okay, so we now know the behavior of the trigrams when they are at upper hex or lower hex. Well, how do these trigrams behave when they are within the hexagrams lines 2 through 5, which is in the 2, 3, 4 configuration or the 3, 4, 5 configuration? The problem with these two configurations is that these two configuration they do overlap, so there are no lower hex and upper hex segregation, so we'll analyze them individually. So first we look at the trigrams appearing in hex lines 2, 3, and 4. So these are the hexagram that we take the average auspiciousness score of their lines when the trigrams is appearing in lines 2, 3, and 4, and there are 8 possibilities when they appear in the heaven configuration, earth configuration, water configuration, and so forth. So here are their plots. So let's use an example. Hexagram 28, treading through overbearing predicament. So for line 2 and 3 and 4, it's a heaven trigrams. Then heaven trigrams at lines 2, 3, 4, as you can see, start out auspiciously and went into the anguish or negative pressure for the lines 3 and 4. And in the overall 6-line auspiciousness plots, they do correspond to the behavior of the trigrams. Similarly, we can also analyze the trigrams appearing in hex lines 3, 4, and 5. And here are the 8 configuration. And as an example, hexagram 55, enriching others from the state of abundance. You can see it's an ascending trend for lines 3, 4, and 5. And indeed, when the lake appears in the 3, 4, 5 configuration within the hexagram 55, indeed it does correlate to a ascending behavior. But what we presented at 2, 3, 4 and 3, 4, 5 are not determining factor, because the trigrams, when they are located within the hexagram at 2 through 5, they are influenced by other factors. For example, in this hexagram 50, establishing new orders, the 2, 3, 4 shows a very strong descending behavior, and yet when their heaven appear in 2, 3, 4, it should come back up at the line 4, and yet at the line 4 for hexagram 50 is quite negative. So why is that? But if you look at this hexagram carefully, you can see the yang lines and yin lines are not in their proper position. So that could have influenced why the line 4s are very negative. Another factor that could affect the auspiciousness reading is, in this example, hexagram 13, striving for equality for all. Because there's a wind trigrams appearing at lines 2, 3, and 4, we would expect a behavior of auspicious, anguish, and then back to auspicious. But in reality, line 2 was quite negative. It's not auspicious at all. So, but if we look at the original hexagram, line 2 is a single yin line amongst all the yang lines. So there's a scarcity factor that influenced the importance of line 2. Furthermore, this particular hexagram is talking about equality, and yet line 2 is the most unique. It's all different. It's not equal to others. It's quite different from all the others. So that could also has influenced why line 2 is especially bad. So to summarize all the trigrams behavior at the different position, we have the following A plots. I'm going to skip through them, but I'm not going to explain to them. But you can pause your video if you want to get the info or look at the characteristic of these 8 trigrams when they are in a different position and how they will behave on the auspiciousness scale. And here's the mountain, here's the wind, here's the thunder, and finally here's the water, because we start out our presentation with the water being located at lines 2, 3, and 4. So what does that water experience? Well, in this case, it's more or less neutral when you're located at lines 2, 3, and 4, slightly negative to slightly positive that the experience should be expecting. So do they resemble the experience of crossing the water? Well, you can have your own judgment on that. In conclusion, first, the interpretation of stacked trigram hexagram cannot be directly used to interpret individual trigrams, because the trigrams meaning differ per different position within the hexagram. We already show through our plots. The plots looks different when they are at upper hex and they are at lower hex. Next, combining multiple trigrams upper and the lower hex behavior can give us more insights to specific hexagram lines and trigrams themselves, and that's what we have discovered earlier. Lastly, the auspiciousness of each hexagram line cannot be derived purely from the trigram characteristics when the trigrams are positioned between lines 2 and 5, because in addition to their general behavior, as we show in our plots, there are yin-yang proper positioning that could affect also the theme of the overall hexagram that's describing. It could be, the theme itself could be positive or negative, and when auspicious line in a negative leaning hexagram, it may not be auspicious. Next is the scarcity of yin and yang line within the hexagram, as we have shown in our example of hexagram 13. Finally, the meaning of the upper and lower trigrams combination or their mutual interaction could also affect the overall behavior.